Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here for another week. And, with every week comes an exciting new guest, unless it's just me recording solo. But this week, I have an exciting new guest. And let me tell you all about her. Her name is Beth Banks Cohn. She's an accomplished organizational consultant, senior executive coach, entrepreneur, and thought leader with more than 25 years of success in the healthcare, pharma, biotech, IT, high-tech, retail, engineering, and manufacturing industries. When smart, forward-looking companies need to reimagine their organization, they turn to ADRA Change Architects. Leveraging her extensive experience in corporate culture, Beth is a valuable asset as she helps companies use organizational transformation to reach the next level of growth. Her broad areas of business experience include IT, manufacturing, sales, marketing, engineering, operations, and human resources, which we all know and love. Beth applies her expertise to business initiatives that might include, but are not limited to, corporate culture, organizational design, M&A, cultural due diligence, communication, and training. She's regarded by many as the authority on culture, leadership, and change. Beth is a sought-out speaker on key aspects of executing. Oh my gosh, let me start that part over. Key aspects of executing organizational change initiatives that stick. Her passion for educating and guiding people have positioned her clients to feel empowered to thrive in an era of uncertain times. Beth began her career at Johnson & Johnson, and over her 16-year tenure, she held various positions of progressive seniority. Beth also holds a PhD in Human and Organizational Systems from the Fielding Graduate University. Her dissertation entitled Culture Makers, the Role of Organizational Culture in Individual Decision-Making, showed how culture is an active rather than a passive part of organizations. This is actually my favorite part of Beth's bio. Beth also holds an MA in Organization Development from Fielding Graduate University, an EDM in Human Resources Education from Boston University, and a BA in International Relations from Simmons University. From Simmons University. She is certified in the Kolbe Index, the Denshin Culture Index, and Myers-Briggs. Beth has authored numerous publications and has written for Change Matters on bizcatalyst360.com. So without further ado, Beth, welcome to the podcast, and welcome to you and your extensive background and educational experience to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I know. I was listening to that and I'm thinking, wow, it's a long time to read my bio now. I don't know what that means.
No, I think it's great. I mean, it's funny because I was thinking about this recently, that at least it feels this way to me in the American society, that when people have all of this experience, that it's like they're overqualified, or there's this at some point there's a shift. People have too little experience, and then they get that experience and they become more senior in their role, and then they have 20 plus years of experience. They apply for a role and they're told they're overqualified. And at some point, we as a community and a culture have to understand that experience is what helps us to grow and to learn from one another. And so I think it's great to have a really long bio. I hope to have a really long bio one day.
Yeah, I hope you do too.
Thank you.
Listen, it makes me able to help companies in a much better way. Like, how I can help companies today is really different than how I could help them, 20 years ago.
Totally. And we're talking about a topic this week or on this episode that is really difficult for a lot of people, and that is change. And I'm sure, if this were a not so family friendly podcast, I'd say drink every time you hear change. But hey, maybe someone will do that anyway. But take that loosely. Drink some orange juice, or drink a champagne or a mimosa, whatever you want. But I think we'll use that term change a lot on this episode because we have to, in order to talk about all of the ins and outs. So I guess just starting off, what makes change so hard, and why do so many people grapple with it?
Well, I think first of all, as humans, we're really hardwired for homeostasis, like for things to stay the same. And so it's just sort of, it's just sort of part of everybody's DNA for things to stay the same. So I think that's one part of it. But I think even beyond that, I think one of the things is that we make change harder than it is by the nature of how we manage it in organizations. And as individuals, we also often make it harder than it is, because instead of thinking about the change from the perspective of, what can I learn from it, what can I take from it, what can I bring to it so that it's not so jarring. We just don't want it to happen because it's not a good time. I have 3 kids. I can't have change. I can't sort of make it work in the lifestyle that I have right now. So we want everything to sort of fit in with us, but change doesn't care, right? Change is just change. And so it's just going to happen. And then you have to figure out how to go with it in some way or another. But I think from an organizational perspective, we do I think we're better at it than we were 20 years ago often. But I think we still underestimate the people that we work with, that work for us, and I think we underestimate the impact of change. And I think there's this sort of wisdom going around that I don't think is very much really wisdom, which is, oh well, if we change often enough, people are just going to figure out how to adapt. And especially after the pandemic, because we did, right? All of a sudden,
Yeah.
like one day we worked in an office and the next day we worked at home. We did
Yeah.
adapt because we had to. It was a crisis. But a crisis change is different, and we do different things in a crisis change than we do in a change that's going on, that could take 6 months to implement, or a year to implement. And so it really is different. And companies really just want it to be over, right? They want to announce the change. They want the change to happen. They want everybody to get in line, and then they want everyone to get back to work. And that never happens. And so they could want that, and it's not even a fantasy because it just never happens. Like, it's not like it happened once. Like, it didn't happen ever. And I think companies just sort of buy into that. Oh, this is, if we just explain it well enough, right? If we just
Yeah.
train people, if we just tap into like their feelings about it. And it just doesn't work that way. First of all, we focus way too much on affect when it comes to change. That's my opinion about how people feel about it. And I think it's really important, but I think it's not the only important thing. I mean, we have 3 parts of the mind. Kathy Kolbe, the creator of the Kolbe Index, talks about this a lot. And the 3 parts of the mind, affective is one, cognitive is the other. And from a cognitive perspective, companies think all they have to do is train people. They have to communicate, right? If we just communicate well enough. But it's not about communication, and it's not about training. I mean, it is to a certain extent. But there's another piece that they're really missing from a cognitive, which is the change actually has to make sense to people. And they have to lead them through their own thought process. As leaders, been through a thought process that brought them to this day when they announced this change. They have to lead people through that. By the time they get to the announcement, executives don't want to talk about it anymore. They just want it done. And that's
Right.
great for them, but it's terrible for everybody else. And it's terrible for the success of the change. And then there's a third part of the mind, which nobody ever talks about, called the conative, or the doing part of the mind, which is where our instincts sit. And how we instinctively solve problems when we're motivated to solve a problem comes from this part of the mind. Now, motivation is an affect, but that instinct comes from another part of our mind, which companies hardly ever think about unless they work with me or another consultant that really works with this 3 parts of the mind. Is that if sometimes you change the organization so much that the instincts that help people be successful are now no longer needed, and people don't know what to do with themselves, right? Because you've changed their job from A to B, and they were great at A, but they're going to be terrible at B. And they're it's just a way of doing things that just doesn't make sense to them in the way that they solve problems. And companies definitely don't take that into consideration because that's way too down at the granular level for most companies. But it is really important in the planning stages anyway to be taking that kind of thing into account. Wow, I've
Absolutely.
talked a lot. I'm going to
No,
stop.
no, please don't stop talking because you're sharing a lot of really great insight. The first thing that I'm going to work backwards in my thought, but the first thing that I'm thinking about right now is how important buy-in is to individuals, but also for companies to make changes. Because, and I've talked about this a few times on the podcast already, that buy-in was like the first thing that I learned in my career, that if you could get the buy-in from your audience, whoever that might be, given what you're rolling out or what you're doing, that it's going to be much easier for change management purposes. That's my first thought. The second thought that I have is that there, at one point, and maybe some companies still feel this way, there was this like push to put people in or on top of projects or working on things that catered to their opportunities and not their strengths, to build up their opportunities, which I can I guess I can reason that. However, I compare it to like when you're in elementary school or middle school and you're at the top of the class and the teacher puts you with someone who is not even trying, and they're doing that to build up the student that's not trying, to make them a better student. But in turn, you're making the really good student potentially a lesser off student because of the lack of focusing on their strengths, right? And so I'm not a teacher by any stretch of the imagination, but it makes me think about how that is like such an archaic thought. Why not just cater to people's strengths so you're getting the best out of each person? So I'm going to pause there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, what you just said is a principle of positive psychology, which is play to people's strengths, right? And if their strengths are strong enough, their opportunities, as you call them, won't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And when I coach people, it's one of the things I really try to focus on is like really, unless they're like really not doing something that they really need to do, is really what are your strengths and how can we play to them so that fixing these other things isn't so much of a burden. I mean, in organizations, I have to say, I believe that it contributes to toxicity. Is there's a hyper focus on fixing people,
Mm-hmm.
right? You should be better at this and you should be better at that. Instead of saying, hey, you know what, you're amazing at this. Like you are an amazing organizer. You like I just have to like say something and you already have a plan in place, right? That's amazing. So instead of playing on that strength, they'll be like, but you're not, when we're trying to get information, you're not so good at gathering information, so or researching, so we should just make you do that all the time, right? So you'll get better at it. But here's the thing about instinct. This is where when you have an instinct to solve a problem in a certain way, if your way of doing it is organizing and not gathering and sharing information, making you gather and share information is never going to get better for you. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be a struggle. You are never going to get better at it. And instead of a company saying, we're just going to make sure that you're the planner and not the gatherer of information, they're like, no, 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 you need to get better at that.
Mm-hmm.
And people can learn how to get better at that. But honestly, why would you want to invest your time and money in that when your employees, if they're really working
Right.
towards their strengths or with their strengths, are going to be amazingly productive for you?
Yeah, it's really a good point. It made me think about what we were talking about right before we started recording, which was, you were saying that you're not much of a like planner in some ways, and I'm not either. I don't pre-write questions for the podcast. I don't do that because I feel my instinct is always to just kind of like fly by the seat of my pants and just like go for it. And that's really where I feel most comfortable. And some people, even thinking about that makes them highly uncomfortable. Like I have recorded with people who could not even imagine not having questions prepared for a guest. And it just, it makes me think about how valuable people's differences are, that, having someone like us in an organization who can just like wing it potentially and go right into something and feel prepared, feel ready to go, versus someone who's going to take whatever steps necessary to make themselves feel comfortable ahead of something. Like there's so much value in both of those personality types or characteristics in an organization. And when you're talking about how companies are so focused on fixing, it's so true. It's why there's an annual review process. Anyone can try and tell me that it's for merit. It's not. I am like a big advocate against these like formal processes. Like I think it's important to review performance, but performance should be reviewed consistently, not just once a year or twice a year. But my whole spiel here is that, an annual review focuses so much on what we need to do better looking ahead, what we need to do differently going forward, instead of celebrating the success of the past year. But also, it's so uh it's so much of like looking in the past versus thinking about, okay, you're really good at X. How can we leverage that more? Because I can only imagine that someone having that conversation is going to leave feeling so much more valued. Because who the heck wants to work on something that they don't enjoy or that caters to their opportunities or things that don't come intuitively to them? I certainly wouldn't want to be doing that. I do think that some of the challenge here comes from a lack of understanding generational differences, and that, in my parents' time, their experience was the only thing that people cared about. But now it's almost like there's been a shift because people do jump around so much more. And there is this, I think, understated understanding or belief that, someone with, even like me, 10 years of experience could do the job of someone who has 20 years of experience. I don't know. I'm throwing out a lot of generalizations there, but this is just like a working theory of mine, that there is a huge miss in understanding generational differences and appreciating that, again, with age comes knowledge and experience, and that there needs to be some sort of hyper awareness on how we're treating candidates with the experience that we feel then is too much experience. Like, why should there be such a thing as too much experience? So, anyway, I realize I have gone on such a tangent here trying to explain my thoughts, but what are your thoughts on generational gaps and how they affect change, how change is affected by generational gaps as well?
Yeah, an important topic to talk about, and I think having been the involved in being the victim of age discrimination, and my husband as
Mm.
well, it's just hurtful.
Mm-hmm.
And this whole idea, it really is about money, right? Because why would you hire somebody that you would have to pay for their experience, right? When you could hire somebody with less experience, and clearly you don't value the role, because if you valued the role, you would think, oh, let's get somebody with really good experience and let's pay for it, and then that'll save us a lot of headaches, right?
Mm.
No, we think, well, but if we just hire somebody with less experience, we could pay them half and then we could save half the money. So it's like it is like a
It's
weird
weird.
dynamic.
Yeah.
And but I do think it's quite interesting to implement change today, and it is really different than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. In that today, people are not as accepting of the bullshit. I'm sorry, am I allowed to say
Mm.
that?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not accepting of that. Like, so, 20 years ago, somebody could stand up in front of the room and say, we're making this change. We're going to have to lay off people. We're,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And I once had this happen in an organization, um, where I was sitting there, and then the person said, "You should all feel lucky that you have jobs."
Mm.
And I thought, and like no one said anything. Like today, somebody would stand up and say, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Like
Yeah.
somebody
Right.
would stand up and say, "How dare you say that to us? You just
Yeah.
announced that 20% of us are losing our jobs. We're all thinking we're the ones, and you're standing up there like, how pompous can you be?"
Right.
Today, people
Right.
wouldn't stand for that. They just wouldn't.
I
And
would
by
hope
the
not.
way, good for them. Like, I look at young people today and I look at what they will not accept organizationally. And I think to myself, good for you. Good
Mm-hmm.
for you. Because the generation before me and my generation, we just sucked it up and got back to work. Right. But this
Yeah.
generation won't do it. And honestly, I'm thrilled because it
Yeah.
holds leaders to a higher standard. And
Yes.
I really think that it has changed the way that I work with companies on change, because sometimes when I go in, somebody will say to me, well, this is the change that we're going to make. And I'll be like, okay, well, sort of walk me through it. Explain to me how you got to this point. And they'll get in the middle of it. And I'll be like, listen, I don't mean to be disruptive or anything, but are you actually serious that like this is what you want to do? Like this sounds like, based on what you're telling me, this sounds like a terrible idea. Right. So I've always been that person that would stand up and say, what the heck is
Sure.
wrong with you? Right. That's why I'm a consultant and I don't work in a company anymore. And, but I do think that sometimes companies think, oh, well, we're just going to say this and it's going to be fine. And I'll be like, I want you to explain to me how you're going to explain that to other people and make it make sense, because it doesn't make any sense to me. But I think companies, like I said at the beginning, companies underestimate their people, and they underestimate what their people are. First of all, they underestimate their smarts, right? So they hire smart people and then they tell them to shut up and get back to work, right? So they underestimate people's need to really be able to justify in their own mind and really get to that evaluation level of cognition. Like, not just get the memo and say, okay, this is what we're going to do, without questioning it. And today people are more vocal about that, and they hold their leaders to higher standards. I mean, I've worked with young people that say to me, I'm not working in this company anymore. I don't respect the leadership. I mean, when you have a generation of people that say that, you better be way better at your leadership, and you better be implementing things in your company that really make sense, that are going to drive the organization forward. And you're hiring smart people. You need to make sure that they can justify it in their own mind. It goes back to the three parts of the mind. You have to be thinking broader than just, we're going to make this decision, we've made it, it's based on numbers, not based on whether or not we can do it, it's not based on anything other than what the spreadsheet tells me, how much money we can make if we do this. It's like layoffs. It's like, well, they say that if we lay off this many people, we're going to save all this money, and then that'll allow us to, make our numbers this year. I'm like, yeah, but then you're going to lose all these people and all this organizational knowledge. So next year, when you want to grow, what are you going to do? Hire new people that don't have the organizational knowledge?
Yeah. No, it's 1,000% true. I was just speaking with another podcast guest about this, that Gen Z is like exceptional. And I think, I'm a millennial, so I am firmly positioned between really feeling like I need to just stick it out and get back to work and all that, and then also having this like, oh well, I can speak up, I can do. So I feel like the millennial is an ombre. It's kind of like a painted picture of both, the prior generation and the generation after us. And I think Gen Z is really remarkable in the way that they don't accept anything less than what they expect. And I get it. There, we heard this when I was growing up too, like, oh, your generation's so entitled, your generation's this. Everyone says that about every generation after them, right? Because there's something that they did better than we did. That's just how it goes. But Gen Z, I mean, I think what's really cool is that there's even an entirely different workforce out there. Like, I was just talking about how influencers and like this whole bubble of work and jobs in social media alone is a totally new adventure. It's an advent, right? Like, it didn't exist when I was growing up. And so you're right. I mean, when something is not meeting someone's expectations in this younger generation, they're going to find something else. And I can really applaud that unwavering sense of what is right. I think that's really amazing, and I would never discourage someone from having that. And I also think when we think about some of these generational gaps, you're right, there is ageism. This is exactly what I was really attempting to get at, that there's when we talk about like company decisions, there are business leaders, hopefully from various generations, representing company interests, sometimes not. But within those decisions, people who are ultimately making those day-to-day decisions are potentially not even looking at the big picture. How does experience benefit the company? How does this person, or how could this person impact us from bringing all of this knowledge? Even if they cost $30,000 more a year, is it worth it for us? Is there an ROI that we can expect there? And so I think thinking about the generational gaps, really the only way that we could probably solve this is by appreciating differences in our generations and appreciating experience more, rather than just looking to save a couple dimes. It always ends up coming down to money. This is the reality. I've been very fortunate to like anytime that I've had to execute or support a layoff process, that it's always been a last in first out, and also performance based decision, not necessarily, looking at who's most experienced, because that, I agree, that is like a surefire way to cut your arm off for the next year if you have to grow. But when we think about how organizations are operating through time, like wavering times, I think in your bio it was called uncertain times, which is true. I think we're always living through uncertain times. I Part of this in my mind, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this too, is not just making a decision because we feel it's right, but actually asking enough people within the organization who are decision makers for their opinions and for their thoughts, because that's where, otherwise you have groupthink, and groupthink isn't good for anything, because then every single person is just thinking the same way, and you're always making the same decisions with the same thought process and not challenging one another. And finally, my last point before I pass it back to you is that this concept of hiring smart people and then not allowing them to be the smart people that we've hired, making it difficult for them to make decisions, not giving them enough credit, all of that is the biggest issue that I have when it comes to change management, or even the way that organizations are developing themselves. And so I really want to expand on that too. But before we get there, like, what do you have any thoughts on that generational piece and decision making side of things? If your company is remote or hybrid, then you know just how difficult it can be to grow your company's culture beyond a pre-scheduled Zoom happy hour or occasional lunch and learn. Well, this week's sponsor is here to solve that. They're called CultureBot. CultureBot has devised what will likely become the gold standard for growing and blossoming a company culture inside of Slack. The app is like a sidekick for any HR or people professional, automating a lot of the mundane tasks you probably are forgetting to do on a daily basis. Things like birthday and work anniversary celebrations, team shoutouts and kudos, employee introductions, and remote games. It even has health and wellness tips and conversation starters. If that piques your interest, this will get you even more excited. Today, I'm able to share a special promotion for listeners of the podcast. You can get your first 6 months of CultureBot for 50% off. Plus, if your team is under 25 employees, CultureBot is free forever. So if you're looking for a way to create a culture of appreciation and drive increased engagement and togetherness across your team, I definitely recommend checking out CultureBot. Go to getculturebot.com/humanhr. That's getculturebot.com/humanhr to get the offer. Plus, I've added the link in the show notes so you can just click right there. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, listen, smart companies really take a look at their workforces when they're really forced to me, like you said, layoffs have to be the last resort. I mean, honestly, the last resort. But let's say you get to that point. It really is looking at the organization holistically and saying, who are our most valuable people, given what we need to do, right? We're laying off for a reason, right? There's a problem. So given the problem that we need to solve, and then wanting to get back to profitability, who are our most valuable people? And then you have to justify it. So it's not like, and it isn't based on money. It's based on sort of the value. So I think I think it's really important to do that. I think part of it is that sometimes companies don't appreciate that organizational knowledge, right?
No.
They really, they really think what they need is somebody new who has different and innovative ways of thinking about things. And I'm not saying that they don't, but I'm saying that then it becomes to them an either or, which I think is a mistake, right? You have to have a blend of people who are going to challenge you and think really differently and come from a completely different perspective, but you also have to have people who have great organizational knowledge that can draw on things that have worked in the past that will continue to work because of the industry that you're in, or the kinds of products that you have. And I think sometimes companies think it's an either or. It's like I talked to somebody the other day about solid citizens, right? In organizations, you need solid citizens. You need people who are going to come to work every day. They're going to show up. They're going to do their job. They're going to do it well. They're not going to be like looking for the next promotion. They're not going to be looking for the next adventure. They just want to do their jobs. And if you all of a sudden think, oh no, I'm not going to value that as much as I value that whippersnapper that I just hired that's got all these amazing ideas but can't figure out how to talk to people well enough to get them to adopt them, like
Mm-hmm.
you can't have all of those kinds of people in a company, and you don't want to have just solid citizens, but you need a blend. It's like
Right.
it's like the parts of diversity, equity, inclusion that we don't talk about. It's like those solid citizens are so important. And I talked to somebody who the other day who was a solid citizen, and she's like, my boss keeps saying to me, well, what are my career goals? And I just want to come to work every day and do a really great job. Like that's not good enough for him. What do I do? And I thought, oh, I wish I could talk to that manager, because
Yeah.
you have a solid citizen and you like want her to become like a superstar. Like for what? It's not even
Right.
what she
Like,
wants.
right. Companies need, to your point, companies need those solid citizens. I call them solid performers because that's what our term is in nine box land, And
Yeah.
for anyone listening who's not familiar with a nine box, it's basically part of understanding where your organization sits from a performance perspective. And it is kind of like placing people within these categories. So they're like strong performer. It's all based on like potential and performance. That's the easiest way to break it down. But solid performers is really where the majority of an organization should sit. And then there should be some people who are not meeting expectations or have low potential. There should be people who are, maybe have a ton of exceptional performance, but low potential because they don't really want to do anything beyond what they're doing. And that's totally okay. And then there are those superstars, but not everyone can be a superstar and not everyone can have low potential, low performance. And this makes me think about something that you said in the beginning about how there's this, drive or feeling of need for homeostasis and everyone kind of having the same thing, whatever that thing is, like the same goals, the same objectives, the same drive. And the reality is that people they're all going to be across the map. There are going to be folks who want to be drive for the highest possible part of their career as quickly as possible. There are going to be people who don't want any more responsibility that they have, and there are going to be people who are potentially just not meeting expectations. And it made me think initially about leaders who, I'm going to use this term very loosely, but like force change on organizations based on what they feel is best, but not necessarily based on where their teams sit, and making changes just because they either, maybe it's a control thing, maybe it's a power thing, or just because they are not asking the right questions of the people who work with them to get their feedback, or maybe they are asking questions and they're not listening. And those changes that happen, whether they're organizational changes or leadership changes, I find that people who are making those decisions without a ton of context, without doing their due diligence to make sure that it's a change that's one, necessary, two, worth their time, and three, going to support people throughout the organization at every level, they're making a lot of changes a lot of the time. And it's just kind of this like rapid fire of, oh, well, this didn't work, let's try this. This didn't work, let's try this, which can be fine in some circumstances, but especially the higher you go in your role, the higher you are up in your role, the more rapid fire your changes are, the more unstable the organization can feel. And so it just made me think about how we can help those folks, how we can hopefully at some point in our career say, hey, let's slow down, don't push the button yet, let's think through this. Because I'll admit I am not always the person thinking through everything, but I have people around me who do. And that is why you have to surround yourself with people who are different from you. Because if I'm only surrounding myself with rapid fire change makers, then, uh, down go the columns that keep the house up, right? But how can we? Is there an anecdote here? How can we help those who are not doing their due diligence to create change that feels good throughout the organization?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because in the Colby Index, there's sort of four major categories for how people instinctively begin the process of solving a problem. We use all four, but usually people have one that's their sort of, we call it initiating. It's how I start. So one of the categories is quick start, and these are people who, that if it's their instinct to initiate in this way, they're the ones who are constantly wanting to try to change things. Like they're like, oh, let's try this and let's try this and let's do this. And it's not just a lot of ideas, it's also the pace of ideas. And when you get someone like that in an organization and they're in a position of power, the most important thing you could do is make sure that they know that that's how they lead, right? So that, and make sure that they know that they can wreak a lot of havoc that is unnecessary and isn't gonna get them to their goals any faster. And so some of it's an education process, but it's helping people really understand that instinctive part of who they are. Because we don't often talk about it, people aren't always in touch with it, right? They're like, oh no, I'm just, that's what I do. Like I come in and I create uncertainty, and then things work out, and then we go forward, and then I create more uncertainty. And like, it's great for them, right? It's great to be at the top in that instance, right? But it's terrible to be underneath that. And so for organizations, for people, it's really important for them to understand what it is that they bring. It's an amazing instinct. And it can really add value to an organization, but used in the wrong way, it can also really be the downfall of an organization. And when you are rewarded for that over and over again, then you think, okay, this is it, right? Everybody should be like me. And that's the other piece of it is, right? As we move up in an organization, we think, well, everybody should be like me. That's wwhy we have performance reviews, so that I can tell everyone that they should be like me.
That's very scary.
Yes, I know, right?
I don't want to be surrounded by everyone that's like me. That's for sure.
Right. Right. Well, exactly. And but by the way, it actually, for a very short period of time, can feel very good. Like when you're in a room of people who you are completely in sync with their instincts, like you're all going after that problem in the exact same way. It actually feels amazing. You're not going to get there because you're all doing it the same way.
Right.
It's going to feel, in that moment, you're going to feel like you met your people. And it's great, right? But it isn't a recipe for a great organization. And so I think it's really important. I didn't come on here to like push the Kolbe Index, but I do think that the Kolbe Index really helps you understand that. And it is one of the things that helps me be better at change in an organization, right? Because I go in and I can see sort of things like the instinct playing a role that but organizations usually won't see, because it's not something that they're really thinking about. And like you said about changes making sense, changing for the sake of change, there are people whose instinct is to change for the sake of change because they need that in some way. It's part of how they get through the day, right? But it's not part of how everybody else gets through the day necessarily, right? And when they meet someone who it is part of how they get through the day, they love that. But it's not helpful necessarily. But it is this whole idea of, somebody once said to me, we change all the time. People don't need, because I was talking to them about, maybe educating people more about sort of different ways of approaching change. And they said, oh no, we're good at it. And I said, are you? And they said, well, yeah, we do it all the time. I'm like, well, that doesn't make you good at it. That just makes you doing it all the time.
It just means
you're changing. No. So I said, well, how often do your changes like really meet the objectives? And they're like, oh, I don't know, because we're just on to the next change. I'm like, well, there you go.
Oh my gosh.
Like you're just changing. Nothing's meeting its objectives. And it doesn't matter because you're just going on to the next change.
Anyway. Right.
That's right. And what's great about that for everybody is nobody has to actually do a lot of stuff, right? Because it doesn't matter if it fails, right? So people are going to adopt or not adopt. I mean, it just doesn't matter because they know that it's going to last for 15 minutes and then you're going to go on to the next thing.
Totally.
It's an interesting way of being. And then of course, then there's the opposite, right? The opposite is we never change. Like we never change. And then when a change comes along, you're like, everybody's in shock, right? Because they don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah.
And so there's that piece of it as well. Like neither end of the spectrum is good or healthy for organizations. There has to be something in the middle, but you do have to approach it as not like how many changes can we make, but what are the changes that really make sense? And into what context are we introducing those changes, right? Why would I introduce a change into an organization that's just gone through major change? Like now with the pandemic, organizations are like, well, we don't understand. People are really resistant to change. Really? That's a surprise? Like,
right.
I just don't understand why that's a surprise to anybody. Well, like, we've been through this like unbelievable change. People's lives have been completely changed. And then you want to introduce like all this other change because you've been waiting all this time because of the pandemic. And now you have all this pent up things you want to do. And so now you're just going to rapid fire do them. And you're wondering why people are resistant. I'll tell you why they're resistant, because they're exhausted.
Right.
And not taking that into consideration is unconscionable. And that's why your people are leaving you, because
Right.
they're not, well, the younger generation. The older generation may just stay because what are they gonna, they're afraid. But
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
the younger ones, they're, the great resignation, like I think it's like the great rethinking of why I would stay with you. Like if you're gonna like do this to me,
Yes.
not paying me enough.
We were all talking about this rebrand from the Great Resignation to the Great Reshuffle, and I was part of that. I left a job where I was for almost 5 years, and I loved it. And I went to this other job, and I was there for only 3 months. I was like, "Oh, this is not good. Nope, leaving." And now I'm at the job where I am now. Actually, we're recording on my 1 year anniversary in this new
Oh,
company,
happy
but
anniversary.
thank you. But it's really, really true. I used to think at first, like maybe a year and a half ago, I used to think, well, if we were so adaptable with the pandemic, we can continue to adapt. We can continue to change. But in recent years, or in recent months, I should say, seeing that companies aren't even willing to make changes, I'm like, oh, well, it's true. It does make sense that after this massive life changing change that was traumatic, was intense, was life altering, some people are still experiencing the effects of COVID, of course, in many ways, that naturally people want some semblance of stability now. And yet, at the same time, what's so interesting is they want this stability with all of the demands that were met during COVID. And that's where companies are having some fatal mistakes, that they are thinking that they can go back to the way things were. So another change, if you ask me, a change that's probably unwanted, because stability doesn't mean that what it was before is more stable. It just means that there has to be a new stability found in this new environment. But, a lot of companies out there are saying we're going back to the office. You can't work remotely, or you can't even work hybrid. And people are like, hey, wait, slow down. I didn't say I wanted to go back to the office. I just said I wanted more stability. I still want flexibility. I still want to work remotely. And so it's a very, very interesting place to be as a society, to watch companies struggle with change, employees, people struggle with change, and then them doing this dance trying to figure that out.
Yes. And what's so interesting about that is that there's this whole set of ideas around, well, if we need to be in person in order to have our culture, whatever
Mm-hmm.
that means, right? And I don't agree with that on any level. And I think it's basically executives who need to have people around them who say, okay, everybody has to come back to the office because
Right. And
I,
they
I
want to
like to see
see what's
the office.
happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Well, it's they want to see what's happening. Why? Like, I mean, that's the thing. It's like they want to see what's happening. Like you're going to walk around and actually see, like, what are you going
Yeah.
to
It's a
see? You're
control
going to
thing.
see people like
Right.
at their computers.
Working.
Like that's what you
Yeah.
want to see. Like
Right.
I could send you a picture of me at my computer every day if that's what you want to see. Like
Right.
it's like this weird idea that culture is only created or formed when you're in person. And I'm not saying that in person isn't important on some level for in general, right? But there's plenty of people in the world who don't need to be in person to form a culture. When in my
Right.
in my dissertation so many years ago, what I said was that culture is a verb, right? Culture is a verb. We are culturing every day. Every action that we take on behalf of our company, whether we're in person or we're not in person, creates the culture. And
Mm-hmm.
what companies fail to realize is, well, they said, oh, well, our culture isn't the same. Well, no, your fantasy of the culture isn't the same. Like the reality
Mm-hmm.
of the culture is what happened when you all went remote. That's the reality of your culture.
Right.
And people reinforce that every day. People got up, they did the work that they needed to do, they were productive, they had the conversations that they needed to have. And yeah, did they not meet each other in the coffee room? Yes, they didn't. But they had virtual coffees. And yes, did you have to plan more? Yes. And for some people that was good, and for some people it wasn't so good. For some people, not being in person was devastating. And so I appreciate that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that those people should be back at work if they need to
Right,
be in person
right,
in order
right.
to be productive. But for a lot of people, it wasn't that. It was about really being able to concentrate and focus and really shine and do the things that they were good at, and not have to get caught up in all the things that they weren't so good at.
Right.
And I think I do think that it is this myth about that culture gets created when you're in person. uh, it, Culture gets created every time you do something,
Yes.
and
I
it gets
1000% agree.
reinforced. And so really thinking about that, I think, is important. And
I
I think that
1000%
companies
agree.
think, well, if we're back in person, then then I can see what you're doing. Well,
I
I
would
knew
quit.
this was going to happen. We all went remote, right? Everybody was amazingly productive. It was amazing.
Yeah.
People were like, "Oh, this is great. We never have to go back." Blah blah. And then all of a sudden, somebody said, "Oh, well, I don't know if I could trust you. I mean, I know I've been trusting you for a year and a half to do it
Right.
remotely, but now I'm not. Now I'm not so sure. Like, are you really? Are you really working like the way that you should be? And maybe if you were in person, like you'd work even harder. Like that's ever going to happen." So it's just like this weird kind of trap that we fell back into. We really didn't change our mindset. The crisis forced us to do something, but companies didn't change their mindsets. Leaders and companies didn't change their mindsets about trusting people, and they didn't change their mindsets about really what it takes to be great at the work that you do. And by the way, there are leaders who did change their mindset. I don't want to be
For
blanket
sure. Of
around that.
course.
Right?
Of
There are
course.
leaders who did, but there's plenty of leaders. The leader of Bloomberg, I'll just give this an example, like and other some of the other financial companies, like they didn't change their mindsets at all. Like they just want butts and seats, and they want you to be there for really long hours, whether they pay you for all those hours or not, because it makes them feel like you're working. But I'll tell you what, this is what I tell people who are workaholics: if you plan to be at the office for 12 hours a day, you're going to figure out your day into 12 hours, but you're not going to do 12 hours of work. You're going to do 8 hours
Correct.
of work. But you're going to take a longer coffee break, and you're going to have a longer lunch, and you're going to take another break in the afternoon. And
Much
so
less
you're going
productive.
to
Yeah.
fit in those 8 hours into 12 hours for what? Just do your 8 hours. Stop
Mm-hmm.
taking long lunches, stop taking long coffee breaks, do your work and go home.
Right.
So it's just going to expand. If you say to me I'm working 18 hours a day, I'm going to say you're not doing 18 hours of work.
Right. Like, what are you doing?
Stop doing 8 hours of work in 18 hours. Doesn't even make
Right.
any sense. The
I
math
don't
doesn't
even
make
I don't even know that 8 hours is necessary. Like if you're really, the problem is that meetings really break down productivity. If you're in meetings, you're not actually necessarily able to work unless you are workshopping or actually physically working in those meetings. Meetings
yeah.
are such a time waste. If I could cancel every single meeting that I have at work, I probably would. Because I just think, this is the whole asynchronous approach coming out that can people okay, maybe you have to meet a couple times to ideate or to brainstorm or to discuss something, but you shouldn't be meetings back to back because then you're not actually working, and then you're spending 40 hours in meetings, 40 hours working, and you're just going to burn out from both ends. So I think that it's true, the mindset needs to change in order for anything else to be able to change. I mean, if leaders have not adapted their mindset to a transformed workforce and a to continue to transform, then I mean, we're always going to see or be able to juxtapose early adopters, companies that are changing and have new mindsets, to these laggards like the firms that you've mentioned who just want to see butts and seats. And you know what, at the end of the day, there might be a person that's right for that environment versus a person that's right for the other, as long as there's an array and some choice there. But I'm of the belief that companies need to just allow the employee to decide. And if the employee wants to be the butt in the seat kind of employee, then let them be that. If they want to work remotely and work flexible hours, let them be that. And it's up to people to be able to work through the differences in belief and perspective around that.
Yeah, that would require managers to be better people managers.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
another hot button of mine.
Another,
right?
right.
And it really comes into play with change, right? In that, when I walk into an organization and let's say they're struggling with a change, the first thing I look at is their managers. Because your managers are going to make or break your change. There's just no two ways about it. And they're either helping you or they're not helping you. It is pretty cut and dried. And managers as people managers is not really as valued in many organizations. Like in some organizations, it's really valued, but in many organizations, it is not. So they want you to be a people manager, but they also want you to do a body of work, which I don't have necessarily an issue with, but you do as a people manager have to balance that. Mm-hmm. And you have to be able to devote enough time to your people because you're getting your work done through them. And we put a lot of people in manager positions that should not be people managers, and then we don't train them.
1,000%. Right.
And we don't really help them see really how to be the best people managers. And often they haven't had a great people manager themselves, so they don't even have somebody they can model themselves after.
Right.
And so I think it's from a change perspective, it's critical, right? If your people managers are not good people managers during times of great change, you're in big trouble.
Right.
Because
absolutely.
They're the ones that they're going to be the messengers. They're going to be the ones who are going to get information that will be important to the change that they need to pass forward. And if all they take out of this change is that they just need to make their people change in some way, and they need to do that however they have to do it, then that's usually not good for adoption, right? And all change is about adoption of something, right? Adoption of a new process, adoption of a new system, adoption of a different way of looking at business. So if you're just focused on making people get in line, you're not really there. Nobody's adopting anything. They're going to get in line until they get another job, or they're going to get in line and they're going to do the bare minimum, but it's not going to get you that return on your change that you thought you were going to get. And so really, really being able to have people managers who are great people managers, who get the best out of their people, who know how to motivate them, who know that each person needs to be motivated in a slightly different way. Like all of those things, if you don't have that and you're going into times of great change in your company, you're in big trouble. You just are. And
it's true.
Companies don't go back and look necessarily at how their change did. And when they do, often they'll lie to themselves about why it didn't work.
Right.
And so that's sad also. And so, but I do think that people managers having great people managers is critical. And it isn't something that companies focus on. It just isn't.
Right.
And we saw during the pandemic, great people managers were still great people managers, and terrible people managers were still terrible people managers.
Right.
The difference, I think, for their employees was now they didn't have to be with them all the time, right? They could just sort of go
there
and
was
do their
distance.
Work.
Right.
That worked.
Right. Well, Beth, thank you so much for all of your insight. I mean, we said change. I should try and count the number of times we said change, because the reality is that if anyone took what I said seriously about drink every time you hear change, if they had any type of adult beverage, they are probably not continuing listening to this episode, but I'm obviously just kidding. Everyone knows, it's 5:00 somewhere, but not 5:00 when this episode comes out. So anyway, Beth, why don't you tell everyone where they can connect with you, where they can learn more about what you do, and all of the things that you've shared with us today.
So first of all, people can email me. My email is Beth@ADRA, ADRA Change, all one word, .com. And then I have a website, ADRAChangeArchitects.com. And of course, you can connect to me on LinkedIn. And I'm always happy to have more connections and to expand the conversation. And it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. And I feel like we've talked about so many different things that are sort of on the inside of change, but also on the outside of change, which is refreshing, because often people think I just focus only on change, but I look at organizations holistically, and there's so many other things going on that affect change, but aren't necessarily sort of directly related to the change. So I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And for all of your insights. Again, we'll make sure that all of your details are in the show notes so that folks can connect with you. And thank you so much again. Thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.